Chapter 31 of The Maid of Sker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Maid of Sker by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 31. Two Lovers. The boat came round the corner swiftly of the wooded stretch of rock, within whose creek I lay concealed, and the officer in the stern sheets cried in the short, sharp tone of custom, "Easy stroke, hold all." I heard him jerk the rudder lines as they passed within biscuit toss of me, and with a heavy sheer he sent her, as if he knew every inch of water, to the steps of Narnton Court. Not the handsome balustrade, only a landing of narrow stone way, nearer to me than the western end, and where the riverside terrace stopped. Two men sprang ashore and made the boat fast at the landing, and then some others lifted out what seemed to be a heavy chest, and placed it on the topmost step, until the officer, having landed, signed to them to bear it further to a corner of the parapet. I could see the whole of these doings, and distinguish him by his uniform, because the boat and the group of sailors were not more than 50 yards from me, and almost in the track of the moon from the place where I was hiding. In a minute or two all returned to the boat, with the exception of the officer, and I heard him give orders from the shore. "Round the point, men. Keep close, and wait for me under the yellow hook I showed you." The coxswain jumped into the stern sheets. In a second or two they had put about, and the light gig, pulling 6 good oars, shot by me on the first of the ebb, as swiftly almost as the wild ducks flew. Meanwhile the officer stood and gazed until they had rounded the western point, from which they had spoiled my shot so, and knowing the vigilant keenness of a British captain's eyes, I feared that he might espy my punt, which would have disgraced me dreadfully. And even without this, I felt how much I would rather be far away. There could have been no man more against my taste to keep a watch upon than a captain in the Royal Navy, whose father might have been over me. And vigorously as I called to mind that all I was doing must be for his good, as well as for that of his relatives, I could not find that satisfaction which ought to flow from such benevolence. However, it now was too late to back out, even if my desire to know the end of this matter allowed of it. The officer stood for a minute or two, as if in brown thoughts and deep melancholy, and turned to the house once or twice, and seemed to hesitate as to approaching it. The long great house, with the broad river front, looked all dark and desolate. Not a servant, a horse, or even a dog was moving, and the only sign of life I could see was a dull light in a little window over a narrow doorway. While I was wondering at all this, and the captain standing gloomily, a little dark figure crossed the moonlight from the shadowy doorway, and the officer made a step or two, and held out his arms and received it. They seemed to stay pretty well satisfied thus, the figure being wholly female, until with a sudden change of thought there seemed to be some sobbing. This led the captain to try again some soft modes of persuasion, such as I could not see into, even if I would have deigned to do a thing against my grain so, because I have been in that way myself, and did not want to be looked at. However, not to be too long over what every man almost goes through, some honestly and some anyhow, but all tending to experience, my only desire was, finding them at it, to get out of the way very quickly. For poor as I am, there were several women of Newton, and Llaleston, and Ewenny, and even of Bridgend, our market town, setting their caps like springles at me. Whereas I laboured at nothing else but to pay respect to my poor wife's memory, and never have a poor woman after her. And now all these romantic doings made me feel uneasy, and ready to be infected, so as to settle with nothing more than had been offered me thrice, and 3 times refused, a 7 foot and 6 inch mangle, and if she proved a tiger, have to work it myself, perhaps. Be that either way, these two unhappy lovers came along while I was wondering at them, yet able to make allowance so, until they must have seen me, if they had a corner of an eye for anything less than one another. They stood on a plank that crossed the narrow creek or slot wherein I lay, under a willow full of brown leaves, and scarcely 10 yards from me. Here there was a rail across, about as big as a kidney bean stick, whereupon they leaned and looked into the water under them. Then they sighed, and made such sorrow, streaked somehow with happiness, that I got myself ready to leap overboard if either or both of them should jump in. However, they had more sense than that, though they went on very tenderly, and with a soft strain, quite unfit to belong to a British officer. Being from ancient, though humble birth, gifted with a deal of delicacy, I pulled out 2 plugs of tobacco, which happened to be in my mouth just now, and I spared them both to stop my ears, though striking inwards painfully. I tried to hear nothing for ever so long, but I found myself forced to ease out the plugs, they did smart so confoundedly; and this pair wanted some one now to take a judicious view of them, for which few men perhaps could be found better qualified than I was, for they carried on in so high a manner that it seemed as if they could be cured by nothing short of married life, of which I had so much experience. And the principle of that state is, that neither party must begin to make too much of the other's side. But being now over that sort of thing, I found myself snug in a corner, and able to view them with interest and considerable candour. "Is there no hope of it, then, after all? After all you have done and suffered, and the prayers of everybody?" This was the maiden, of course, having right to the first word and the last of it. "There is hope enough, my darling, but nothing ever comes of it. And how can I search out this strange matter, while I am on service always?" "Throw it up, Drake, my dear heart, for my sake. Throw it up, and throw over all ambition, until you are cleared of this foul shame." "My ambition is slender now," he answered, "and would be content with one slender lady." Here he gave her a squeeze that threatened not only to make her slenderer, but also to make the rail need more stoutness, and me to keep ready for plunging. "Nevertheless, you know," he went on, when the plank and the rail put up with it, "I cannot think of myself for a moment, while I am thus on duty. We expect orders for America." "So you said, and it frightens me. If that should be so, whatever ever can become of us?" "My own dear, you are a child, almost a child, for a man like me, knocked about the world so much, and ever so unfortunate." The rest of his speech was broken into, much to my dissatisfaction, by a soft caressing comfort, such as women's pity yields without any consideration. Only they made all sorts of foolish promises and eternal pledges, touched up with confidence and hope and mutual praise and faith and doubt, and the other ins and outs of love. "I won't cry any more," she said, with several sobs between it. "I ought not to be so with you, who are so strong and good and kind. Your honour is cruelly wronged at home. You never shall say that your own love wished you to peril it also abroad." He took her quietly into his arms, and they seemed to strengthen one another, and to my eyes came old tears, or at any rate such as had come long ago. These two people stood a great time, silent, full of one another, keeping close with reverent longing, gazing, yet not looking, at the moonlight and the water. Then the delicate young maiden, for such her voice and outline showed her, though I could not judge her face, shivered in the curling fog which the climbing moon had brought. Hereupon the captain felt that her lungs must be attended to, as well as her lips, and her waist, and heart; and he said in a soft way, like a shawl. Come away, my lovely darling, from the cold and fog and mist. Your little cloak is damp all through, and time it is for me to go. Discipline I will have always, and I must have the same with you until you take command of me. Many, many a weary year ere I have the chance of it, Captain Drake." The young thing sighed as she spoke, though perhaps without any sense of prophecy. "Isabel, let us not talk like that, even if we think it. The luck must turn some day, my darling. Even I cannot be always on the evil side of it. How often has my father said so? And what stronger proof can I have than you, as long as you are true to me?" They were turning away when this bright idea, which seems to occur to lovers always, under some great law of nature, to prolong their interviews, this compelled them to repeat pretty much the same forms and ceremonies, assurances, pledges, and such like, which had passed between them scarcely more than 3 or 4 minutes ago, at the utmost. And again I looked away, because I would have had others do so to me, and there was nothing new to learn by it. "Only one thing more, my own," said the lady, taking his arm again. "One more thing you must promise me. If you care for me at all, keep out of the way of that dreadful man." "Why, how can I meet him at sea, my Bell? Even if he dislikes me, as you tell me perpetually, though I never gave him cause, that I know of." "He does not dislike you, Drake Bampfylde. He hates you, with all the venomous coal-black hatred, such as I fear to think of. Oh, my dear! Oh, my dear!" "Now, Isabel, try not to be so foolish. I never could believe such a thing, and I never will, without clearest proof. I never could feel like that myself, even if any one wronged me deeply. And in spite of all my bad luck, Bell, I have never wronged any one, at least more than you know of." "Then don't wrong me, my own dear love, by taking no heed of yourself. Here, there, and everywhere seems to be his nature. You may be proud of your ship and people, and of course they are proud of you. You may be ordered to Gibraltar, where they have done so gloriously, or to America, or to India. But wherever you are, you never can be out of the reach of that terrible man. His ways are so crooked and so dark, and so dreadfully cold-blooded." "Isabel, Isabel, now be quiet. What an imagination you have! A man in holy orders, a man of a good old family, who have been ancient friends of ours." "A bad old family, you mean. Bad for generations. It does not matter, of course, what I say, because I am so young and stupid. But you are so frank and good and simple, and so very brave and careless, and I know that you will own some day oh, it frightens me so to think of it that you were wrong in this matter, and your Isabel was right." What his answer was I cannot tell, because they passed beyond my hearing upon their way towards the house. The young lady, with her long hair shining like woven gold in the moonlight, tried, so far as I could see, to persuade him to come in with her. This, however, he would not do, though grieving to refuse her, and she seemed to know the reason of it, and to cease to urge him. In and out of many things which they seemed to have to talk of, he showed her the great chest in the dark corner, and perhaps she paid good heed to it. As to that, how can I tell, when they both were so far off, and river fogs arising? Yet one thing I well could tell, or at any rate could have told it in the times when my blood ran fast, and my habit of life was romantic. Even though the light was foggy, and there was no time to waste, these two people seemed so to stay, with a great dislike of severing. However, They managed it at last, and growing so cold in my shoulders now, as well as my knees uncomfortable, right glad was I to hear what the maiden listened to with intense despair, that is to say, the captain's footfall, a yard further off every time of the sound. He went along the Braunton road to find his boat where the river bends, and much as I longed to know him better, and understand why he did such things, and what he meant by hankering so after this young lady, outside his own father's house, and refusing to go inside when invited, and speaking of his own bad luck so much, and having a chest put away from the moonlight, likewise his men in the distance so far, and compelled to keep round the corner, not to mention his manner of walking, and swinging his shoulders, almost as if the world was nothing to him. Although I had never been perhaps so thoroughly pushed with desire of knowledge, and all my best feelings uppermost, there was nothing for me left except to ponder, and to chew my quid, rowing softly through the lanes and lines of misty moonlight, to my little cuddy home across the tidal river. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Maid of Sker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Maid of Sker by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 32 Among the Savages. At this moment it became a very nice point to perceive what was really honest and right, and then to carry it out with all that fearless alacrity which, in such cases, I find to be, as it were, constitutional to me. My high sense of honour would fain persuade me to keep in strictest secrecy that which, so far as I could judge, was not, or might not have been, intended for my eyes, or ears, or tongue. On the other hand, my still higher sense of duty to my employer, which is a most needful and practical feeling, and that power of loyalty which descends to me, and perhaps will die with me, as well as a strong and no less ancestral eagerness to be up to the tricks of all mysterious beings. I do not exaggerate when I say that the cutwater of my poor mind knew not which of these two hands pulled the stronger oar. In short, being tired and sleepy and weary, and worn out with want of perceiving my way, although I smoked 3 pipes all alone, not from the smallest desire for them, but because I have routed the devil thus many and many a night, I know, as the priests do with their incense, the reason of which I take to be, that having so much smoke at home, he shuns it when coming for change of air, growing dreamy thus. I said, with nobody to answer me, I will tumble into my berth, as this dirty craft has no room for hammocks, and between parson and captain I will leave my dreams to guide me. I played with myself in saying this. No man ever should play with himself. It shows that he thinks too troublesomely, and soon may come, if he carries it on, almost to forget that other people are nothing, while himself is everything. And if any man comes to that state of mind, there is nothing more to hope of him. I was not so far gone as that. Nevertheless, it served me right, for thinking such dreadful looseness, to have no broad fine road of sleep, in the depth whereof to be borne along, and lie wherever wanted; but instead of that, to toss and kick, with much self-damage, and worst of all, to dream such murder, that I now remember it. What it was belongs to me, who paid for it with a loss of hair very serious at my time of life. However, not to dwell upon that, or upon myself in any way, such being my perpetual wish, yet thwarted by great activity, let it be enough to say that Parson Chowne in my visions came, and horribly stood over me. Therefore, arising betimes, I hired a very fine horse, and manning him bravely, laid his head east and by south, as near as might be, according to our binnacle. But though the wind was abaft the beam, and tide and all in his favour, and a brave commander upon his poop, what did he do but bouse his stem, and run out his spanker driver, and up with his taffrail, as if I was wearing him in a thundering heavy sea. I resolved to get the upper hand of this uncalled for mutiny, and the more so because all our crew were gazing, and at the fair I had laid down the law very strictly concerning horses. I slipped my feet out of the chains, for fear of any sudden capsize, and then I rapped him over the catheads, where his anchor ought to hang. He, however, instead of doing at all what I expected, up with his boltsprit and down with his quarter, as if struck by a whale under his forefoot. This was so far from true seamanship, and proved him to be so unbuilt for sailing, that I was content to disembark over his stern, and with slight concussions. "Never say die" has always been my motto, and always will be. Nailing my colours to the mast, I embarked upon another horse of less than half the tonnage of that one who would not answer helm, and this craft, being broken backed, with a strange sound at her portholes, could not under press of sail bowl along more than 4 knots an hour, and we adjusted matters between us so, that when she was tired, I also was sore, and therefore disembarked and towed her, until we were both lit for sea again. Therefore it must have been good meridian when I met Parson Chowne near his house. This man was seldom inside his own house, except at his meal times, or when asleep, but roving about uncomfortably, seeing to the veriest trifles, everywhere abusing or kicking everybody. And but for the certainty of his witchcraft, ninefold powerful, as they told me, when conferred upon a parson, and the black strength of his eyes, and the doom that had befallen all who dared to go against him, the men about the yards and stables told me, when he was miles away, that they never could have put up with him, for his wages were also below their deserts. He came to me from the kennel of hounds, which he kept not for his own pleasure so much as for the delight of forbidding gentlemen, whenever the whim might take him so, especially if they were nobly accoutred, from earning at his expense the glory of jumping hedges and ditches. Now, as he came towards me, or rather beckoned for me to come to him, I saw that the other truly eminent parson, the Reverend John Rambone, was with him, and giving advice about the string at the back of a young dog's tongue. Although this man was his greatest friend, Master Chowne treated him no better than anybody else would fare, but signed to the mate of the hounds, or whatever those fox hunters call their chief officer, to heed every word of what Rambone said. Because these two divines had won faith throughout all parishes and hundreds, Chowne for the doctrine of horses, and for discipline of dogs, John Rambone. His reverence fixed a stern gaze upon me, because I had not hurried myself, a thing which I never do except in a glorious naval action, and then he bade me follow him. This I did, and I declare even now I cannot tell whither he took me, for I seemed to have no power in his presence of heeding anything but himself. Only I know that we passed through trees, and sat down somewhere afterwards. Wherever it was, or may have been, so far as my memory serves, I think that I held him at bay some little. For instance, I took the greatest care not to speak of the fair young lady, inasmuch as she might not have done all she did, if she had chanced to possess the knowledge of my being under the willow tree. But Parson Chowne, without my telling, knew the whole of what was done, and what he thought of it none might guess in the shadowy shining of his eyes. "You have done pretty well on the whole," he said, after asking many short questions, "but you must do better next time, my man. You must not allow all these delicate feelings, chivalry, resolute honesty, and little things of that sort, to interfere thus with business. These things do some credit to you, Llewellyn, and please you, and add to your happiness, which consists largely with you, as it does with all men, in conceit. But you must not allow yourself thus to coquet with these beauties of human nature. It needs a rich man to do that. Even add my 5 shillings to your own 4, and you cannot thus go to Corinth." I had been at Corinth twice, and found it not at all desirable, so I could not make out what his reverence meant, except that it must be something bad, which at my time of life should not be put into the mind even by a clergyman. But what I could least put up with was, the want of encouragement I found for all my better feelings. These seemed to meet with nothing more than discouragement and disparagement, whereas I knew them to be sound, substantial, and solid. And I always felt upon going to bed what happiness they afforded me. And if the days of my youth had only passed through learned languages, Latin and Greek and Hebrew, I doubt whether even Parson Chowne could have laid his own will upon me so. "Supposing, then, that your reverence should make it 10," I answered, "with my own 4, that would be 14." "I can truly believe that it would, my man, and you may come to that if you go on well. Now go into the house and enjoy yourself. You Welshmen are always hungry, and you may talk as freely as you like, which is your next desire. Every word you say will come back to me, and some of it may amuse me. If you have no sense, you have some cunning. You will know what things to speak of, and be sure that you wait until I come back." This was so wholly below and outside of the thing which I love to reconcile with my own constitution, having so long been respected for them, as well as rewarded by conscience, that I scarcely knew where or who I was, or what might next come over me. And to complete my uncomfortable sense of being nobody, I heard the sound of a galloping horse downhill, as wild as could be, and found myself left as if all the ideas which I was prepared to suggest were nothing. However, that was not my loss, but his, so I entered the house with considerable hope of enjoying myself as commanded. For this purpose I have always found it, in the house of a gentleman, the height of luck to get among 3 young women and 1 old one. The elderly woman attends to the cooking, which is not understood by the young ones, or at any rate cannot be much expected, while on the other hand the young ones flirt in and out in a pleasant way, laying the table, and showing their arms, which are of a lovely red, as good as any gravy. And then if you know how to manage them well, with a wholesome deference to the old cook, and yet an understanding, while she is basting, and, as one might almost say, behind her back, a confidential feeling established, that you know how she treats those young ones, and how harshly she dares to speak, if a coal comes into the dripping pan. And in casting it out she burns her face, and abuses the whole of them for her own fault. Also a little shy suggestion that they must put up with all this, because the old cook is past sweethearting time, and the parlour maid scarcely come to it, accompanied by a wink or two, and a hint in the direction of the stables. Some of the very noblest dinners that ever I made have been thus introduced. But what forgiveness could I expect, or who would listen to me, if I dared to speak in the same dinner hour of the goodly kitchen at Candleston Court, or even at Court Isha, and the place that served as a sort of kitchen, so far as they seemed to want one, at this Nympton Rectory? A chill came over every man directly he went into it, and he knew that his meat would be hocks and bones, and his gravy, if any, would stand cold dead. However, I made the best of it, as my manner is with everything; and though the old stony woman sat, and seemed to make stone of every one, I kept my spirits up, and became, in spite of all her stoppage, what a man of my knowledge of mankind must be among womankind. In a word, though I do not wish to set down exactly how I managed it, in half an hour I could see, while carefully concealing it, that there was not a single young woman there without beginning to say to herself, "Should I like to be Mrs Llewellyn?" After that I can have them always, but I know them too well to be hasty. No prospects would suit me at my time of life, unless they came after some cash in hand. The louts from the stables and kennels poured in, some of them very degustant, as my Bardie used to say. Nevertheless the girls seemed to like them, and who was I, even when consulted, to pretend to say otherwise? In virtue of what I had seen among barbarous tribes and everywhere, and all my knowledge of ceremonies and the way they marry one another, it took me scarcely half an hour, especially among poor victuals, to have all the women watching for every word I was prepared to drop. Although this never fails to happen, yet it always pleases me, and to find it in Parson Chowne's kitchen go thus, and the stony woman herself compelled to be bitten by mustard for fear of smiling, and 2 or 3 maids quite unfit to get on without warm pats on their shoulder blades, and the dogs quite aware that men were laughing, and that this meant luck for them if they put up their noses. It was not for me to think much of myself, and yet how could I help doing it? In the midst of this truly social joy and natural commune over victuals, and easing of thought to suit one another in the courtesies of digestion, and just as the slowest amongst us began to enter into some knowledge of me, in walked that great Parson Rambone, with his hands behind his back, and between them a stout hunting crop. The maidens seemed to be taken aback, but the men were not much afraid of him. "What a rare royster you are making! Out by the kennel, I heard you. However can I write my sermons?" "Does your reverence write them in the kennel?" Thus the chief huntsman made inquiry, having a certain privilege. "Clear out, clear out," said Rambone, fetching his whip toward all of us. "I am left in authority here, and I must have proper discipline. Mrs Steelyard, I am surprised at you. Girls, you must never go on like this. What will his reverence say to me? Come along with me, thou villain Welshman, and give me a light for my pipe, if you please." It was a sad thing to behold a man of this noble nature, having gifts of everything, whether of body or heart or soul, only wanting gift of mind, and for want of that alone making wreck of all the rest. I let him lead me, while I felt how I longed to have the lead of him, but that was in stronger hands than mine. "Come, and I'll show thee a strange sight, Taffy," he said to me, very pleasantly, as soon as his pipe was kindled. "Only I must have my horse, to inspire them with respect for me, as well as to keep my distance. Where is thy charger, thou valiant Taffy?" I answered his reverence that I would rather travel afoot, if it were not too far. Neither could he persuade me, after the experience of that morning, to hoist my flag on an unknown horse, the command of which he offered me. So forth we set, the parson on horseback and in very high spirits, trolling songs, leaping hedges, frolicking enough to frighten one, and I on foot, rather stiff and weary, and needing a glass of grog, without any visible chance of getting it. "Here, you despondent Taffy, take this, and brighten up a bit. It is true you are going to the gallows, but there's no room for you there just now." I saw what he meant, as he handed me his silver hunting flask, for they have a fashion about there of hanging bad people at crossways, and leaving them there for the good of others, and to encourage honesty. And truly the place was chosen well, for in the hollow, not far below it, might be found those savage folk of whom I said something a good while ago. And I did not say then what I might have said, because I felt scandalised, and unwilling to press any question of doubtful doings upon thoroughly accomplished people. But now I am bound, like a hospital surgeon, to display the whole of it. "Take hold of the tail of my horse, old Taffy," said his reverence to me, "and I will see you clear of them. Have no fear, for they all know me." By this time we were surrounded with 15 or 20 strange looking creatures, enough to frighten anybody. Many fine savages have I seen, on the shores of the Land of Fire, for instance, or on the coast of Guinea, or the Gulf of Panama, and in 50 other places, yet none did I ever come across so outrageous as these were. They danced and capered, and caught up stones, and made pretence to throw at us, and then with horrible grimaces showed their teeth and jeered at us. Scarcely any of the men had more than a piece of old sack upon him, and as for the women, the less I say, the more you will believe it. My respect for respectable women is such that I scarcely dare to irritate them by not saying what these other women were as concerns appearance. And yet I will confine myself, as if of the female gender, to a gentle hint that these women might have looked much nicer if only they had clothes on. But the poor little piccaninnies, as the niggers called them, these poor little devils, were far worse off than any hatch of negroes, or maroons, or copper colours anywhere in the breeding grounds; not so much from any want of tendance or clean management, which none of the others ever got, but from difference of climate, and the moisture of their native soil. These little creatures, all stark naked, seemed to be well enough off for food of some sort or another, but to be very badly off for want of washing and covering up, and their little legs seemed to be growing crooked, the meaning of which was beyond me then, until I was told that it took its rise from the way they were forced to crook them in to lay hold of one another's legs for the sake of natural warmth and comfort, as the winter time came on, when they slept in the straw all together. I believe this was so, but I never saw it. The Reverend John Rambone took no other notice of these people than to be amused with them. He knew some 2 or 3 of the men, and spoke of them by their nicknames, such as Brownie, or Horsehair, or Sandy Boy, and the little children came crawling on their bellies to him. This seemed to be their natural manner of going at an early age, and only one of all the very little children walked upright. This one came to the parson's horse, and being still of a tottery order, laid hold of a foreleg to fetch up his own, and having such moorage, looked up at the horse. The horse, for his part, looked down upon him, bending his neck as if highly pleased, yet with his nostrils desiring to snort, and the whole of his springy leg quivering, but trying to keep quiet, lest the baby might be injured. This made me look at the child again, whose little foolish life was hanging upon the behaviour of a horse. The rider perceived that he could do nothing, in spite of all his great strength and skill, to prevent the horse from dashing out the baby's brains with his forehoof, if only he should rear or fret. And so he only soothed him. But I, being up to all these things, and full for ever of presence of mind, slipped in under the hold of the horse as quietly as possible, and in a manner which others might call at the same time daring and dexterous, I fetched the poor little fellow out of his dangerous position. "Well done, Taffy," said Parson Jack. "I should never have thought you had sense enough for it. You had a narrow shave, my man." For the horse, being frightened by so much nakedness, made a most sudden spring over my body before I could rise with the child in my arms, and one of his after hoofs knocked my hat off, so that I felt truly thankful not to have had a worse business of it. But I would not let any one laugh at my fright. "A miss is as good as a mile, your reverence. Many a cannon ball has passed me nearer than your horse's hoof. Tush, a mere trifle. Will your reverence give this poor little man a ride?" And with that I offered him the child upon his saddle bow, naked and unwashed, and kicking. "Keep off, or you shall taste my horsewhip. Keep away with your dirty brat. And yet, oh poor little devil, if I only had a cloth with me." For this parson was of tender nature, although so wild and reckless; and in his light way he was moved at the wretched plight of this small creature, and the signs of heavy stripes upon him; not all over him, as the parson said, being prone to exaggerate, but only extending over his back, and his hams, and other convenient places. And perhaps my jacket made them smart, for he roared every time I lifted him; and every time I set him down, he stared with a wistful kind of wonder at our clothes, and at the noble horse, as if he were trying to remember something. "Where can they have picked up this poor little beggar?" said Parson Jack, more to himself than to me. "He looks of a different breed altogether. I wonder if this is one of Stoyle's damned tricks." And all the way back he spoke never a word, but seemed to be worrying with himself. But I, having set the child down on his feet, and dusted my clothes, and cleaned myself, followed the poor little creature's toddle, and examined him carefully. The rest of the children seemed to hate him, and he to shrink out of their way almost; and yet he was the only fine and handsome child among them; for in spite of all the dirt upon it, his face was honest, and fair, and open, with large soft eyes of a dainty blue, and short thick curls of yellow hair that wanted combing sadly. And though he had rolled in muddy places, as little wild children always do, for the sake of keeping the cold out, his skin was white where the mud had peeled, and his form lacked nothing but washing. Chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Maid of Sker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Maid of Sker by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 33 In a State of Nature. Now all these things contributed, coming as they did so rapidly, to arouse inside me a burning and almost desperate curiosity. It was in vain that I said to myself, "These are no concerns of mine. Let them manage their own affairs. The less I meddle, the better for me. I seem to be in a barbarous land, and I must expect things barbarous. And after all, what does it come to, compared with the great things I have seen, ay, and played my part in? To reason thus, and regard it thus, and seek only to be quit of it, was a proof of the highest wisdom any man could manifest, if he could only stick to it. And this I perceived, and thus I felt, and praised myself for enforcing it so, until it became not only safe, but a bounden duty to reward my conscience by a little talk or so. Hence I lounged into the stable yard, for that terrible Chowne was not yet come back, neither were maids to be got at for talking, only that stony steelyard, and there I found 3 or 4 short-sleeved fellows hissing at horses, and rubbing away to put their sleeping polish on them before the master should return. Also 3 or 4 more were labouring in the stalls very briskly, one at a sort of holy stoning, making patterns with brick and sand, and the others setting up the hammocks for the nags to lie in, with a lashing of twisted straw aft of their after heels and taffrails, as the wake of a ship might be. And all of it done most ship-shape. This amused me mightily, for I never had seen such a thing before, even among wild horses, who have power to manage their own concerns. But to see them all go in so snugly, and with such a sweet clean savour, each to his own oats or mashings, with the golden straw at foot, made me think, and forced me to it, of those wretched white barbarians, white at least just here and there, whom good Parson Jack, as one might almost try to call him, had led me to visit that same afternoon. Perceiving how the wind sat, I even held back and smoked a pipe, exactly as if I were overseer, and understood the whole of it, yet did not mean to make rash reproach. This had a fine effect upon them, especially as I chewed a straw, by no means so as to stop my pipe, but to exhibit mastery. And when I put my leg over a rail, as if I found it difficult to keep myself from horseback, the head man came to me straightforward, and asked me when I had hunted last. I told him that I was always hunting, week days and Sundays, and all the year round, because it was our fashion; and that we hunted creatures such as he never had the luck to set eyes on. And when I had told him a few more things, such as flow from experience, when mixed with imagination, a duller man than myself might see that he longed for me to sup with him; and he spoke of things that made me ready, such as tripe and onions. However, this would never do. I felt myself strongly under orders, and but for this paramount sense of duty, never could I have done the things modestly mentioned as of yore, and those of hereafter tenfold as fine, such as no modesty dare suppress. So when I had explained to him exactly how I stood about it, he did not refuse to fill his pipe with a bit of my choice tobacco, and to come away from all idle folk to a place in the shelter of a rick, where he was sure to hear the hoofs of his master's horse returning. I sat with him thus, and we got on well; and as he was going to marry soon the daughter of a publican, who had as good as £50, and nothing that could be set on fire, and lived 50 miles away almost, he did not mind telling me all the truth, because he saw that I could keep it. and at his age he could not enter into the spirit of being kicked so. I told him I should like to see a man kick me, but he said that I might come to it. This was a very superior man, and I durst not contradict him, and having arranged so to settle in life, how could he hope to tell any more lies? For I have always found all men grow pugnaciously truthful, so to put it, for a month almost before wedlock, while the women are doing the opposite. However, not to go far into that, what he told me was much as follows. Parson Chowne, in early life, before his mind was put into shape for anything but to please itself, had been dreadfully vexed and thwarted. Every matter had gone amiss directly he was concerned in it. His guardians had cheated him, so had his stepmother, so had his favourite uncle, and of course so had his lawyers done. In the thick of that bitterness, what did his sweetheart do but throw him over? She took a great scare of his strange black eyes when she found that his money was doubtful. This was instinct, no doubt, on her part, and may have been a great saving for her, but to him it was terrible loss. His faith was already astray a little, but a dear wife might have brought it back, or at any rate made him think so. And he was not of the nature which gropes after the bottom of everything like a twisting augur. Having a prospect of good estates, he was sent to London to learn the law, after finishing at Oxford, not that he might practise it, but to introduce a new element to the county magistrates, when he should mount the bench among them. Here he got rogued, as was only natural, and a great part of his land fell from him, and therefore he took to the clerical line, and being of a stern and decided nature, he married 3 wives, one after the other, and thus got a good deal of property. It was said, of course, as it always is of any man thrice a widower, that he or his manor had killed his wives, a charge which should never be made without strong evidence in support of it. At any rate, there had been no children, and different opinions were entertained whether this were the cause or effect of the parson's dislike and contempt of little ones. Moreover, as women usually are of a tougher staple than men can be, Chowne's successive liberation from 3 wives had added greatly to his fame for witchcraft, such as first accrued from his commanding style, nocturnal habits, method of quenching other people, and collection of pots and kettles. The head groom told me with a knowing wink that in his opinion the parson was now looking after wife number 4, for he never had known him come out so smart, with silver heels and crested headpiece, and even the mark of the saddle must not show upon his breeches. This was a sure sign, he thought, that there was a young lady in the wind, possessing both money and good looks, such as Chowne was entitled to, and always had insisted on. Upon that point I could have thrown some light, if prudence had permitted it, or at least I had some shrewd suspicions, after what happened beside the river. However, I said nothing. But I asked him what in his opinion first had soured the young man Chowne against the whole of the world so sadly as he seemed to retain it now. And he answered me that he could not tell, inasmuch as the cause which he had heard given seemed to him to be most unlikely, according to all that he saw of the man. Nevertheless I bade him tell it, being an older man than he was, and therefore more able to enter into what young folk call inconsistencies. And so he told me that it was this. Chowne, while still a young boy, had loved with all the force of his heart a boy, a few years younger than himself, a cousin of his own, but not with prospects such as he had. And this boy had been killed at school, and the matter hushed up comfortably among all high authorities. But Stoyle Chowne had made a vow to discover and hunt it out to the uttermost, and sooner or later to have revenge. But when his own wrongs fell upon him, doubtless he had forgotten it. I said that I did not believe he had done so, or ever would, to the uttermost. Then I asked about Parson Jack, and heard pretty much what I expected, that he was a well-meaning man enough, although without much sense of right or wrong, until his evil star led him into Parson Chowne's society. But still he had instincts now and then, such as a horse has, of the right road, and an old woman of his church declared that he did not feel his own sermons, and if he let alone and listened to, might come to act up to them. I asked whether Parson Chowne might do the like, but was told that he never preached any. We were talking thus, and I had quite agreed to his desire of my company for supper time, when the sound of a horse upon stony ground, tearing along at a dangerous speed, quite broke up our conference. The groom, at the sound of it, damped out his pipe, and signified to me to do the same. "I have fired a many of his enemies' ricks," he whispered in his haste and fright; "but if he were to smell me a smoking near to a rick of his own, good Lord!" And he pointed to a hay rope, as if he saw his halter. And though he had boasted of speedy marriage, and caring no fig for Parson Chowne, he set off for the stables at a pace likely to prove injurious to his credit for consistency. On the other hand, I, in a leisurely manner, picked myself up from the attitude natural to me, when listening kindly, and calmly asserting my right to smoke, approached the track by which I knew that the rider must come into the yard. For all the dogs had no fear of me now, by virtue of the whistle which I bore. And before I had been there half a minute, the Parson dashed up, with his horse all smoking, and himself in a heavy blackness of temper, such as I somehow expected of him. "No Jack here, not a Jack to be seen. Have the kindness to look for my stable whip. Ho, Llewellyn, is it?" "Yes, your Reverence, David Llewellyn, once of his Majesty's Royal Navy, and now of " "No more of that. You have played me false. I expected it from a rogue like you. Restore me that trussed guinea." This so largely differed from what even Anthony Stew would dare to say in conversation with me, much less at times of evidence, that I lifted up my heart to heaven, as two or three preachers had ordered me, and even our parson had backed it up, with lineage at least as good, and perhaps much better than Parson Chowne's, by right of Welsh blood under it. The whole of this overcame me so, that I could only say, "What guinea, sir?" "What guinea, indeed! You would rob me, would you? Don't you know better than that, my man? Come to me in 2 hours' time. Stop! Give me that dog's whistle." Taking that heed of me, and no more, he cast the reins to my friend the head groom, who came up, looking for all the world as if never had he seen me, and wondered strangely who I could be. And this air of fright and denial always pervaded the whole household, all of which was quite against what I had been long accustomed to, wherever I deigned to go in with my news to the servants' place, or the housekeeper's room, or anywhere pointed out to me as the best for entertainment. Here, however, although the servants seemed to be plentiful enough, and the horses and the hounds to have as much as they could eat, there was not a trace of what I may call good domestic comfort. When this prevails, as it ought to do in every gentleman's household, the marks may be discovered in the eyes and the mouth of everybody. Nobody thinks of giving way to injudicious hurry when bells ring, or when shouts are heard, or horses' feet at the front door. And if on the part of the carpeted rooms any disquietude is shown, or desire to play, or feed, or ride, at times outside the convenience of the excellent company downstairs, there's nothing more to be said, except that it cannot be done, and should never in common reason have been thought of. For all servants must enjoy their meals, and must have time to digest them with proper ease, for conversation and expansion afterwards. At Candleston Court it was always so, and so it should be everywhere. However, to return to my groom, whose cordiality revived at the moment his master turned the corner, perceiving that Chowne had some matter on hand which would not allow him to visit the stables, just for the present at any rate, he turned the black mare over to the care of an understrapper, and with a wink and a smack of his lips, gave me to know that his supper was toward. Neither were we disappointed, but found it all going on very sweetly, in a little private room used for cleaning harness. And he told me that this young cook maid of unusual abilities had attached herself to him very strongly, with an eye to promotion, and having no scent of his higher engagement. Neither would he have been unwilling to carry out her wishes if she could only have shown a sixpence against the innkeeper's daughter's shilling. I told him that he was too romantic, and he said with a sigh that he could not help it, but all would come right in the end, no doubt. This honest affection impressed me not a little in his favour, and in less than half an hour I found him a thoroughly worthy fellow. While he perceived, through a square stalked rummer, that my character was congenial, I told him therefore some foreign stories, many of which were exceedingly true, and he by this time was ready to answer almost anything that I chose to ask, even though he knew nothing about it. As for the people that wore no clothes, but lived all together in the old mud house, there need be and could be no mystery. Every one knew that his reverence had picked them up in his early days, and been pleased with their simple appearance and dislike of cultivation. Perceiving even then how glad he might be in after life to annoy his neighbours, what did he do but bring these people, then six in number, and all of them wives and husbands to one another, and persuade them to dig themselves out a house, and by deed of gift establish them on 40 acres of their own land, so that, as Englishmen love to say, their house was now their castle. Not that these were perhaps English folk, but rather of a gipsy cross, capable, however, of becoming white if a muscular man should scrub them. The groom said that nobody durst go near them except Parson Chowne and Parson Jack, and that they seemed to get worse and worse as they began to be persecuted by clothes wearing people. I asked him what their manners were, and he said he believed that they were good enough, so long as not interfered with, and who could blame them for maintaining that whether they wore clothes or not was entirely their own concern. Also that if other strangers intruded, from motives of low curiosity, upon their unclad premises, it was only fair to point out to them the disadvantages of costume, by making it very hard to wash. There was some sense in this, because the main anxiety of mankind is to convert one another, and the pelting of mud is usually the beginning of such overtures; and these fine fellows having recurred, as Parson Chowne said, to a natural state, their very first desire would be to redeem all fellow creatures from the evils of civilisation, whereof the foremost perhaps is clothes, and the time we take in dressing, a twelfth part of their waking life, with even the wisest women, and with the unwise virgins often not less than three quarters, and with many men not much better. But to come back to my savages, I asked this good groom how it came to pass that none of the sheriffs, or deputies, or even magistrates of the shire, put down this ungoodly company. He said that they had tried, but failed, according to the laws of England, on the best authority. Because these men of the ancient Adam went back to the time before the beasts had come to Adam to get their names, they brought up their children without a name, and now all names were dying out, and they agreed much better in consequence. And how could any writ, warrant, or summons run against people without a name? It had once been tried with a Nesho kiss, the meaning of which was beyond me, but Parson Chowne upset that at once, and the bailiff was fit to make bricks of. At this I shook my head and smiled, because we put up with many evils on our side of the water, but never with people so unbecoming in their manner of life and clothes. And I thought how even mild Colonel Lougher would have behaved upon such a point, and how sharp Anthony Stew would have stamped when they began to pelt him, and how I wished him there to try it. Nevertheless, I desired to know what victuals these good barbarians had, because although, like the Indian yogis mentioned by some great traveller, they might prove their right to go without clothes, which never were born upon them, they could not, to my mind, prove their power to do so well without victuals. He answered that this was a clever thing on my part to inquire about, but that I was so far wrong that these people would eat anything. His reverence sent them every week the refuse of his garden, as well as of stable yard and kennel, and they had a gift of finding food in everything around them. Their favourite dish, so to say, when they had never a dish among them, was what they discovered in the pasture land, and this they divided carefully, accounting it the depth of shame and the surest mark of civilisation to cheat one another. But they could not expect to get this every day in a neighbourhood of moorland; therefore, instead of grumbling, they did their best to get on without it. And Providence always sends thousands of victuals for all whose stomachs have not been ruined by thinking too much about them, or very likely through women beginning to make them delicate. So when a man is seasick, he thinks of and hates almost everything. On the other hand, these noble fellows hated nothing that could be chewed. 21 sorts of toadstool, with the insects which inhabit them, 3 varieties of eft, and of frogs no less than 7. Also slugs 6 inches long, too large to have a house built; moles that live in lines of decks, like a man of war's man; also rats, and brindled hedgehogs, and the grubs of hornets, which far surpass all oysters. These and other little things, like goat moths, leopards, and money grubs, kept them so alive as never to come down on the parish. Neither was there any hen roost, rick yard, apple room, or dairy on the farms around them, but in it they found nourishment. Into all this I could enter, while the groom only showed the door of it. But while we were talking thus, I heard the stable clock strike 8, which brought Hezekiah to my mind, and my own church clock at Newton. It struck in such a manner that I saw the door of my own cottage; also Bunny in bed, with her nostrils ready to twitch for snoring, and Mother Jones with a candle, stooping to ease her by means of a drop of hot grease; and inside by the wall lay Bardie, sleeping, as she always slept, with a smile of high born quietude. And what would all 3 say to me, if ever I got back again? Thanking this excellent groom for all his hospitality to me, and promising at his desire to keep it from his master, I took my way, as pointed out, to the room where his reverence might be found. I feared that his temper would be black, unless he had dined as I had supped, and taken a good glass afterwards. And I could not believe what the groom had told me concerning one particular. There is a most utterly pestilent race arising and growing up around us, whose object is to destroy old England, by forbidding a man to drink. St. Paul speaks against them, and all the great prophets; and the very first thing that was done by our Lord, after answering them in the temple, was to put them to shame with a great many firkins. Also one of the foremost parables is concerning bottles, as especially honest things, while bushels are to the contrary. And the tendency of all Scripture is such, whichever Testament you take, that no man in his wits can doubt it. And though I never read the Koran, and only have heard some verses of it, I know enough to say positively that Mahomet began this movement to establish Antichrist. However, my groom said that Parson Chowne, though not such a fool as to stop other people, scarcely ever took a drop himself, and his main delight was to make low beasts of the clergy who had no self command. And 2 or 3 years ago he had played a trick on his brother parsons, such as no man would ever have tried who took his own glass in moderation, and enjoyed it heartily, as Scripture even commands us to do, to promote good fellowship and discretion. Having a power of visitation from some faculty he enjoyed, he sent all round to demand their presence at a certain time for dinner. All the parsons were glad enough, especially as their wives could not, in good manners, be invited, because there was now no Mrs Chowne, and they saw a rare chance to tell good stories, and get on without the little snaps which are apt to occur among ladies. Therefore they all appeared in strength, having represented it as a high duty, whatever their better halves might think. When a parson says this, his wife must knock under, or never go to church again. Being there, they were treated well, and had the good dinner they all deserved, and found their host very different from what they had been led to expect of him. He gave them as much wine as they needed, and a very good wine too. He let them tell their stories, though his own taste was quite different, and he even humoured them so as to laugh the while he was despising them. And though he could not bear tobacco, that and pipes were brought in for them. All went smoothly, until one of them, edged on by the others, called for spirits and hot water. This Master Chowne had prepared for of course, and meant to present the things in good time. But now being gored thus in his own house, the devil entered into him. His dark face grew of a leaden colour, while he begged their pardon. Then out he went to Mother Steelyard, and told her exactly what to do. 2 great jacks of brown brandy came in, and were placed upon the table, and 2 silver kettles upon the hobs. He begged all his guests to help themselves, showing the lemons and sugar candy, the bottles and kettles, and everything. And then he left them to their own devices, while he talked with Parson Jack, who had dropped in suddenly. Now what shall I tell you came to pass, as a very great traveller always says? Why, only that these parsons grew more drunk than despair or even hope, because in the silver kettles was not water, but whisky at boiling point, and the more they desired to weaken their brandy, the more they fortified it, until they tumbled out altogether in every state of disorder. For this he had prepared, by placing at the foot of his long steps 6 butts of liquid from the cleaning of his drains, meant to be spread on the fields next day. And into the whole of this they fell, and he bolted the doors upon them. This made a stir in the clerical circles when it came to be talked about, but upon reference to the bishop he thought they had better say nothing about it, only be more considerate, and on the whole it redounded greatly to the credit of Parson Chowne. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Maid of Sker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Maid of Sker by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 34, Waiting and Learning. What this great man now said to me had better not be set down perhaps, because it proved him incapable of forming due estimate of my character. Enough that he caused me some alarm and considerable annoyance by his supercilious vein and assumption of evil motives. Whereas you could not find anywhere purer or loftier reasons, and I might say more poetical ones, than those which had led me to abstain from speaking of the fair young lady. However, as this Chowne had learned all about her from some skulking landsman, whom he maintained as a spy at the back of the premises, it was certain that I could in no way harm her, by earning a trifle of money in front, in a thoroughly open and disciplined way. And it might even lie in my power thereby to defeat the devices of enemies, and rescue this beautiful young female from any one who would dare to think of presuming to injure her. I found my breast and heart aglow with all the fine feeling of younger days the moment the above occurred to me, and it would not have cost me 2 blows to knock down any man who misunderstood me. However, his reverence did not afford me any chance for this exercise, but seemed to allow me the benefit which such ideas afford a man, and promised to give me 3 half-crowns instead of 5 shillings a week as before. He allowed me a hay loft to sleep in that night, after taking good care that I had not even a flint to strike a light with; for, cordially as he did enjoy the firing of an enemy's barns or stacks, his reverence never could bear the idea of so much as a spark coming near his own. And the following morning I saddled my horse with a good chain undergirding, and taking turn and turn about, got home to the Rose of Devon. And here I found very unjust work, Fuzzy gone, and Ike not to be found, and the ketch laid up for the winter. Only Bang the boy was left, and the purpose of his remaining was to bear me a wicked message; namely, that I had been so much away, both in the boat and on horseback, that the captain would not be bound to me except to get home again how I might. And if this could not be brought about, and I chose to take care of the ketch for the winter, 2 shillings a week was what I might draw, also the wood on the wharf, so long as it would last for firing, and any fish I could catch with lines, and any birds I could shoot on the river, with a stone of rock powder that was in the hold. Bang was ashamed to deliver this message, and I cannot describe to you my wrath, as slowly I wrung it out of him. His head went into his neck almost, for fear of my taking it by the handles, which nature had provided in his 2 ears, and letting him learn, as done once before, that the mast had harder knots in it. But I always scorn injustice, and Bang was not to be blamed for this. So I treated him kindly, as I might wish a boy of my own to be treated by a man of large experience, and I let him go home to his mother's house, which was said to be somewhere within a league, and then I went to see what manners had been shown in the pickling tub. Here I found precious little indeed, and only the bottom stuff of coxcombs, tails, and nails, and overharpings, thready bits, and tapeworm stuff, such as we pray deliverance from, unless it comes to famine. Nevertheless, in my now condition, I grieved that there was not more of it, because how could I get across to my native land again? All the small coasting craft were laid up, as if they were china for shelfing, immediately after that gale of wind, which, but for me, must have capsized us. These fellows up the rivers never get a breath of seamanship. Sudden squalls are all they think of. Sea room, and the power of it, they would be afraid of. At one time I thought of walking home, because none of these traders would venture it, and if I had only a guinea to start with on the road to Bristol, nothing could have stopped me, for, say what I might to myself about it, and reason however carefully, I could not reconcile with my conscience these things that detained me. The more I considered only 3 half-crowns, and the mere chance of wild ducks on the river, the less I perceived how my duty lay, and the more it appeared to be movable. And why was I bound to stop here like this, when their place was to take me home again, according to stipulation? To apply to the mayor, as I knew, was useless, especially now that I owed him a bill. As for the bench of magistrates, one had already a bias against me, because I went into a wood one night to watch an eclipse of the moon, and took my telescope, which they all swore was a gun. Being disappointed with the moon's proceedings, I slammed up my telescope hastily, and at the same time puffed my pipe, and there was a fellow on watch so vile as to swear to the sound and the smoke of a gun. And this fellow proved to be a Welshman of the name of Llewellyn, and a cousin of mine within 7 generations. I acquit him of knowing this fact at the time, and when in cross-examination I let him know it, and nobody else, he came back to his duty, and swore white all the black he had sworn before. Nevertheless, I did not like it, though acquitted amidst universal applause, on account of the notoriety. And finding him one night upon the barge walk, and his manners irritating, I was enabled to impress him with a sense of consanguinity, and after that I might bear my telescope, and take observation throughout the coverts, whenever the pheasants did not disturb me. This privilege, and a flight of wild ducks, followed by a team of geese, and rumours even of 2 wild swans, moderated my desire to be back at home again. There no man can get a shot, except in very bitter weather, or when the golden plovers come in, unless he likes to take on himself a strong defiance of public opinion. Because Colonel Lougher is so kind, and so forbears to prosecute, that to shoot his game is no game at all, and shames almost any man afterwards. And the glory of all that night work is, the sense of wronging somebody. Moreover, a little thing occurred, which in my doubt of conclusion led me to stay a bit longer. Some people may think nothing of it, but a kind touch takes a hold on me. I have spoken of a boy by the name of Bang, possessing many good qualities, yet calling for education. Of this I had given him some little, administered not to his head alone, but to more influential quarters, and the result was a crop of gratitude watered by humility. When he went home for the winter months, I expected to hear no more of him, having been served in that manner often by boys whom I have corrected. Therefore all who have ever observed the want of thankfulness in the young, will enter into my feelings when an ancient woman, Bang's grandmother, hailed me in a shaky voice over the side of my ketch, with Bang in the distance watching her. Between her feet was a good large basket, which, with my usual fine feeling, I leaped out to ease her of, but on no account would she let me touch it until she knew more about me. "Be you the man?" she said. madam," I answered, "I be the man. The man as goes on so wicked to bang for the sake of his soul hereafter." "Yes, madam, I am he who clothe in the wholesome garb of severity a deep and parental affection, for now I smell something uncommonly good." "Be you the chap as walloped him?" "That I can proudly say I am." "Look'ee see here, this be for 'ee, then." With no common self approval I observed what she turned out, although I longed much to unpack them myself, for fear of her spoiling anything. But she put me back in a wholesale manner, and spread it all out like a market stand. And really it was almost enough to make a market of, for she was a very wiry old woman, and Bang had helped carry as far as the wharf when he saw me, and fled. Especially did I admire a goose, fat with golden fat upon him, trussed and laid on stuffing herbs; also a little pig for roasting, too young to object to it, yet with his character formed enough to make his brains delicious; and as for sausages, but no more. The goodness of these things preserved me from going off on the tramp just yet. That is the last thing a sailor should do, though gifted with an iron tipped wooden leg. The government drove me into it once, when my wound allowed me to be discharged; but it took more out of my self respect than ever I have recovered. And if I do anything under the mark, which to my knowledge I never do, it dates from the time the king drove me to alms. However, I never do dwell upon that, unless there is something wrong down in my hold; and when that is right, I am thankful again. And none of that ever befalls me when I get my rations regular. But who cares to hear any more about me, with all these great things coming on? You may look on me now as nobody. Because I fell so much beneath my own idea of myself, and all that others said of me, through my nasty want of strength, when Parson Chowne came over me. It is easy enough to understand that a man in good nature may knock under to another man of good nature also, all in friendship and in fun, and for the benefit of the world. But for a man of intellect not so very far under the average, as will now be admitted of me, in spite of all inborn diffidence, as well as a man of a character formed and framed by experience, now to be boarded and violently driven under hatches, without any power to strike a blow, by a man who was never on board of a ship, at any rate to my knowledge, to think of this, and yet not help it, made me chafe like a fellow in irons. There was one thing, however, that helped to make me put up my present position a little, and that was my hope to be truly of service to my genuine benefactor, poor Sir Philip Bampfylde. This old gentleman clearly was not going on very comfortably, and Parson Chowne had given me to understand, without any words, that the great chest landed at the end of his house was full of arms and all other treason. These were to be smuggled in after the captain's departure, and the captain would not enter the house through fear of the servants suspecting something. I could not reconcile this account with what I had seen the young lady do, and the captain's mode of receiving it. But as I would not tell the parson a word about that young lady, I could not make that objection to him. Nor did I say, though I might have done so, that I would not and could not believe for a moment that any British naval captain would employ his ship and crew for a purpose of high treason to his lawful master. That Parson Chowne should dare to think that I would swallow such stuff as that, made me angry with myself for not having contradicted him. But all this time I was very wise, and had no call to reproach myself. Seldom need any man repent for not having said more than he did, and never so needeth a Welshman. And now, though I still took observation of Narnton Court, as in honour bound to deserve my salary, and though the parson still rode down, and went the round of the deck at times when nobody could expect him, yet it was not in my nature to be kept from asking something as to all these people. You may frighten a man, and scare his wits, and keep him under, and trample on him, and even beat his feelers down, and shut him up like a jellyfish; but after all this, if he is a man, he will want to know the reason. For this makes half of the difference between man and the lower animals. The latter, when punished, accept it as a thing that must befall them, and so do the negroes, and all proper women. But a man always wants to know why it must be, though it greatly increases his trouble to ask, and still more to tell it again, if you please. Sir Philip Bampfylde Bampfylde, as every one said, was a very nice gentleman indeed, the head of an ancient family, and the owner of a large estate; kind, moreover, and affable, though perhaps a little stately, from having long held high command and important rank in the army. Some years ago he had attained even to the rank of general, which is the same thing among land forces as an admiral is with us, and he was so proud of this position that he always wished to be so addressed, rather than by the title which had been so long in the family. For his argument was that he had to thank good fortune for being a baronet, whereas good conduct and perseverance alone could have made him a general. Now, if these had made him a general, I would always entitle him so. As it is, I shall call him Sir Philip, or General, just as may happen to come to my mind. Now this gentleman had two sons, and no other children. The elder was Philip Bampfylde, Esquire, and the younger Captain Drake Bampfylde, of whom I have spoken already. Philip, the heir, had been appointed to manage the family property, which spread for miles and miles away, and this gave him quite enough to do, because his father for years and years was away on foreign service. And during this time Squire Philip married a lady of great beauty, sent home by his father from foreign parts after rescue from captivity. She was of very good extraction, so far as foreigners can be, and a princess, they said, in her own right, though without much chance of getting it, and she spoke the prettiest broken English, being very sensitive. Well, everything thus far went purely enough, and the lady had brought him a pair of twins, and was giving good promise of going on, and everybody was pleased with her, and most of all her husband, and Sir Philip was come home from governorship, but only on leave of absence, and they were trying hard to persuade him now to retire and live in peace, when who should come with his evil luck to spoil everything but Drake Bampfylde. How it came to pass was not clearly known, at least to the folk on our side of the river, or those whom I met in Barnstaple, and I durst not ask on the further side, that is to say, around Narnton Court, because the parson's spies were there. Only the old women felt pretty sure that they had heard say, though it might be wrong, that Captain Drake Bampfylde had drowned the children, some said by accident, some said on purpose, and buried them somewhere on Braunton Burrows. And the effect of this on the foreign lady, being as she was, poor thing, might have been foreseen almost, for she fell into untimely pains, and neither herself nor her babe survived, exactly as happened to my son's wife. This was a very sad story, I thought, but they said that the worst of it still lay behind, for poor Squire Philip had been so upset by the hurry of all these misfortunes, that nobody knew what to do with him. He always had been a most warm-hearted man, foolishly fond of his wife and children, and of a soft and retiring nature. Moreover, he looked on his younger brother, who had seen so much more of the world than himself, and was of a bolder character, not with an elder son's usual carelessness, but with a thorough admiration. And when he found him behave in this manner, according at least to what every one said, and all for the sake of the property, without a sharp word between them, it went to his heart, in the thick of his losses, so that he was beside himself. He let his beard grow, and his hair turn white, although he was not yet 40, and he put up the shutters of his room, and kept candles around him, and little dolls. He refused to see his brother Drake, and his father Sir Philip, and everybody, except his own attendant, and the nurse of his poor children, and finding this, the captain left the house as if cursed out of it. The only one who took things bravely was the ancient general. Much as he grieved at the loss of his race, and extinction perhaps of the family, he swore that he never would be cast down, or doubt the honour of his favourite son, until that son confessed it. This Drake Bampfylde had never done, although the case was hard against him, and scarcely any one except his father now stood up for him. But of the few who still held him guiltless, one was a special comforter, Isabel Carey to wit, a young lady of very good Devonshire family, left as a ward to Sir Philip Bampfylde, and waiting for 3 or 4 years more of age to come into large estates in South Devon. The general people did not know this, but I happened to get ahead of them, and having a knack in my quiet way of putting two and two together, also having seen the captain and shaped my opinions, I would have staked my boat against a cuttlefish that he was quite innocent. If the children were found buried, although I could never quite get at this, but only a story of a man who had seen him doing it, as I shall tell hereafter, but even supposing them deep in the sand, which I was a little inclined to do, from trusting my spyglass so thoroughly, yet there might have been other people quite as likely to put them there as that unlucky Captain Drake. It has been my lot to sail under a great many various captains, not only whom I have hinted at in the days when I was too young for work, but whom I mean to describe hereafter in my far greater experiences, really finding, although I have tried to convince people to the contrary, that what they have told me was perfectly true, and that I come out far stronger and better whenever my reins are tried and proved, and my loins as sound as a bell, although hereditary from King David. Let that pass. I find one fault, and it is the only one to be found with me. It is that the style of our bards will come out, and spread me abroad in their lofty allusions. To come back to these captains, I never found one who would do such a thing as kill and slay two children, much less dig their graves in the sand, and come home to dinner afterwards. And of all the captains I had seen, Drake Bampfylde seemed as unfit as any to do a thing of that dirtiness. However, as I have not too much trust in human nature, after the way it has used me, and worst of all when in the government, I said to myself that it was important to know at what time this Captain Bampfylde won the love of that fine Miss Carey, because after that he had no temptation to put the little ones out of the way, and I quite settled it in my own mind, that if they had set up their horses together before the young children went out of the world, Captain Drake Bampfylde was not likely to have made them go so; for that fair maiden's estates, I was told, would feed 400 people. No one had seen this exactly as I did, nor could I beat it into them; and I found from one or two symptoms that it was high time for me to leave off talking. Parson Chowne came down one night, as black as a tarred thunderbolt; and though he said nothing to let me know, I felt afraid of his meaning. Also Parson Jack rode down, in his headlong careless way, and filled his pipe from my tobacco bag, and gave me a wink, and said, "Keep your mouth shut." It was always a pleasure to me to behold him, whatever his principles may have been; and if I could have said a word to stop him from his downward road, or to make it go less sudden, goodness knows I would have done it, at the risk of 3 half-crowns a week. Chapter 34. Chapter 35 of the Maid of Sker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Maid of Sker by R.D. Blackmore. Chapter 35. The Polite Ferryman. Now for a man of my age and knowledge, keeping an eye on his own concerns, and under the eyes of a good many women, eager to have him, because confessed superior to the neighbourhood, yet naturally doubtful how much money would be wanted; for such a man to attend to things which could not concern him in any way, without neglecting what now he had found a serious matter at his time of life. This, to my mind, proves a breadth of sympathy rarely found outside of Wales. Entering into these things largely, and desiring to do my best, having moreover nought else to do, except among dabs and flounders, I was led by a naturally active mind to try to turn a penny, not for my own good so much as for the use of Bunny. Therefore, having the punt at command, and a good pair of oars, and a good pair of arms, what did I do but set up a ferry, such as had never been heard of before, and never might have been dreamed of, except for my intelligence; because we had 2 miles to Barnstaple bridge, and no bridge at all to be found below us, and a good many houses here and there on either side of the river. and I saw that they must know one another, and were longing to dine or to gossip together, except for the water between them, or the distance to walk all the way by the bridge. So, being left in this desolate state, and shamefully treated by Captain Fuzzy and Bang's grandmother, now neglecting me at a period of sadness, while smoking a pipe, Providence gave me this brilliant idea. I never had dreamed for a moment of settling without something permanent, and not even £30 a year would tempt me to do any despite to my late dear wife's remembrance. A year and a day at the very least was I resolved to mourn for her. Still, as the time was drawing on, I desired to have some prospect, not to settle rashly, as young people do in such affairs, which really should be important, but to begin to feel about, and put the price against the weight, and then take time to think about it. Only I had made up my mind not to look twice at the very richest and most beautiful Methodist. Enough had I had for my life of them, and the fellows that come after them. Church of England or Church of Rome, for me this time at any rate; with preference to the latter, because having no chapel in our neighbourhood. And I worked this ferry, if you will believe me, not for the sake of the twopence both ways, half so much as because of my thoughts of the confidence that I must create. I knew for I won't say 40 years, but at any rate good 30, what women are the very moment they must needs come into a boat. The very shyest and wisest of them are at the mercy of a man right out. And I never could help believing that they come for that very reason. I know all their queerness of placing their toes, and how they fetch their fingers up, and manage to hitch their petticoats, and try to suppose they are quite on a balance, and then go down plump on the nearest thwart, and pretend that they did it on purpose. Nevertheless, they are very good, and we are bound to make the best of them. When I told Parson Chowne of my ferry boat, rather than let him find it out, which of course must have happened immediately, a quick gleam of wrath at my daring to do such a thing without consulting him moved in the depth of his great black eyes. At least I believed so, but was not sure, for I never could bear to look straight at his eyes, as I do to all other people, especially Anthony Stew, Esquire. I thought that my ferry would be forbidden, but with his usual quickness he saw that it might serve his purpose in several ways, because it would help to keep me there, as well as account for my being there, and afford me the best chance in the world of watching the river traffic. So he changed his frown to an icy smile, such as I never could smile at, and said, "Behold now what good luck comes of my service. Only remember, no fares to be taken when the tide serves for you know what, and especially no gossiping." This being settled to my content, I took a great piece of loose tarpaulin out of the hold of the Rose of Devon, and with a bucket of thick lime whiting explained to the public in printing letters, each as large as a marlinspike, who I was, and of what vocation, and how thoroughly trustworthy. And let any one read it, and then give opinion in common fairness whether any man capable of being considered a spy would ever have done such a thing as this: David Llewellyn, mariner of the Royal Navy, ferryman to King George the Third, each way or both ways only twopence. Ladies put carefully over the mud. Live fish on hand at an hour's notice, and of the choicest quality. This last statement was not quite so accurate as I could have desired. To oblige the public, I kept the fish too long on hand occasionally, because I never had proper notice when it might be wanted, and therefore no reasonable person ever took offence at me. One fine day towards the frosty time, who should appear at my landing stage on the further side of the river, just by the lime kiln, not far from the eastern end of Narnton Court, who but a beautiful young lady, with her maid attending her. The tide was out, and I was crossing with a good sixpennyworth, that being all that my boat would hold, unless it were of children. And seeing her there, I put on more speed, so as not to keep her waiting. When I had carried my young women over the mud, and received their twopences, I took off my hat to the fair young lady, who had kept in the background, and asked to what part I might have the honour of conveying her ladyship. "I am not a ladyship," she answered, with a beautiful bright smile. "I am only a common lady, and I think you must be an Irishman." This I never am pleased to hear, because those Irish are so untruthful. However, I made her another fine bow, and let her have her own way about it. "Then, Mr Irishman," she continued, "you are so polite, we will cross the water." "No, no, thank you," as I offered to carry her. "You may carry Nanette, if she thinks proper. Nanette has the greatest objection to mud, but I am not quite so particular." And she tripped with her little feet over the bank too lightly to break the green cake of the ooze. "You sall elave me, my good man," said Nanette, who was rather a pretty French girl. "Mamselle can afford to disfigure her dress, but I can no such thing do at all." Meanwhile the young lady was in the boat, sitting in the stern sheets like a lieutenant, and laughing merrily at Nanette, who was making the prettiest fuss in the world, not indeed with regard to her legs, which an English girl would have considered first, but as to her frills and fripperies; and smelling my quid, she had no more sense than to call me a coachman, or something like it. However, I took little heed of her, although her figure was very good, for I knew that she could not have sixpence, and scarcely 100 a year would induce me to degrade myself down to a real French wife, for how could I expect my son ever to be a sailor? Now as I pulled, and this fine young lady, who clearly knew something about a boat, nodded her head to keep time with me, and showed her white teeth as she smiled at herself, my own head was almost turned, I declare. And I must have blushed, if it could have been that 20 years of the fish trade had left that power in me; because this young lady was so exactly what my highest dreams of a female are, and never yet realised in my own scope. And her knowledge of a boat, and courage, and pleasant contempt of that French chit, who had dared to call me a coachman, when added to her way of looking over the water with fine feeling, such as I very often have, and must have shown it long ago, also the whole of this combined with a hat of a very fine texture indeed, such as I knew for Italian, and a feather that curled over golden pennon of hair in the wind like a Spanish ensign. And not only these things, but a face, and manner, and genuine beauty of speech, not to be found in a million of women. After dwelling on all these things both steadily and soberly, over my last drop of grog, before I went into my berth that night, and prayed for the sins of the day to go upward, what do you think I said, on the half deck, and with all the stars observing me? "I'm damned if I'll serve Parson Chowne any more." I said it, and I swore it. And when I came to think of it in a practical manner next morning, and to balance the ins and outs, and what I might come to, if thus led astray by a man in holy orders, yet whose orders were all unholy, at any rate such as he gave to me; and when I reflected on 3 half crowns for finding me in everything, and then remembered how I had turned 2 guineas in a day, when poor Bardie came to me, and with a conscience as clear as a spent cuttle fish, and never a sign of my heels behind me, when squeamish customers sat down to dinner, also good Mother Jones with sweet gossip, while my bit of flesh was grilling, and my little nip of rum, and the sound of Bunny snoring, while I smoked a pipe and praised myself. Also the pleasure of doubting whether they could do without me at the jolly through the wall, and the certain knowledge how the whole of the room would meet me if I could deny myself enough to go among them. These things made me lose myself, as in this sentence I have done, in longing to find old times and places and old faces once again, and some one to call me old Dio. Now who would believe that the whole of all this was wrought in my not very foolish mind by the sight of a beautiful high bred face, and the sound of a very sweet softening voice? Also the elegant manner in which she never asked what the passage would come to, but gave me a bright and true half crown for herself and that frippery French girl. I must be a fool, no doubt I am, when the spirit of ancestors springs within me, spoiling all trade, as an inborn hiccup ruins the best pipe that ever was filled. For though I owed 3 tidy bills, I had no comfort until I drilled a little hole in that bright half crown, and hung it with my charms and knobs and caul inside my jersey. And thus the result became permanent, and my happiness was in my heart again, and all my self-respect leaped up as ready to fight as it ever had been, when I had shaped a firm resolve to shake off Chowne like the devil himself. I cannot imagine a lower thing than for any man to say, and some were even to that degree base, that I thus resolved upon calculation, and ability now to get on without him, and balance of his 3 half crowns against the income of my ferry, with which I admit that his work interfered. Neither would any but a very vile man dare to cast reflections upon me, for having created by skill and eloquence a small snug trade in the way of fish, and of those birds which are sent by the Lord in a casual way, and without any ownership, for the good of us unestated folk. While I deny as unequivocally as if upon oath before magistrates, that more than 50 hares and pheasants. But there, I may go on for ever rebutting those endless charges and calumnies, which the mere force of my innocent candour seems to strike out of maliciousness. Once for all, I never poach, I never stab salmon, I never smuggle, I never steal boats, I never sell fish with any stink outside of it. And how can I tell what it does inside, or what it may do afterwards? I never tell lies to anybody who does not downright call for it; and you may go miles and miles, I am sure, to find a more thoroughly honourable, good hearted, brave, and agreeable man. Now I did not mean to say any of this when I began about it; neither am I in the habit of deigning even to clear myself. But once beginning with an explanation, I found it the best to start clear again, because Parson Chowne, and my manner towards him, which for the life of me I could not help, also my service under him, and visit at his house, and so on, and even my liking for Parson Jack after his sale to Satan, though managed without his privity, as well as my being had up for shooting pheasants with a telescope; these and many other things, too small now to dwell upon, may have spread a cloud betwixt my poor self and my readers, and a cloud whose belly is a gale of wind. It is not that I ever could do any unworthy action; it is simply that I can conceive the possibility of it seeming so to those who have never met me, and who from my over candid account, purposely shaped dead against myself, may be at a loss to enter into the delicacies of my conduct. But you shall see by and by, and seeing is believing. Now it was a lucky thing that on the very morning after I had made up my mind so, and before it was altered much, down came Chowne in a tearing mood, with his beautiful black mare all in a lather. I was on board of the Rose of Devon, smoking my first after breakfast pipe, and counting my cash from the ferry business of the day before, except of course the half crown which lay among my charms, and strengthened me. The ketch was aground in a cradle of sand, which she had long ago scooped for herself, and which she seldom got out of now, except just to float at the top of the springs. She stood almost on an even keel, unless it were blowing heavily. Our punt, or rather I should call her mine by this time, for of course she most justly belonged to me, after all their breach of contract and desertion of their colours. At any rate, there she was afloat, and ready for any passenger, while my notice to the public flapped below the main boom of the ketch. "You precious rascal!" cried Chowne from the wharf, with his horse staring at the tarpaulin, and half inclined to shy from it. "Who was it crossed the river twice in your rotten ferry boat yesterday?" "Please your reverence," I answered calmly, puffing at my pipe, which I knew would still more infuriate him. "Will your reverence give me time to think? Let me see. Why, let me see. There was Mother Pugsley from up the hill, and Mother Bidgood from round the corner, and Farmer Skinner, and young Joe Thorne, and Eliza Tucker from the mill, and Jenny Stribling, and Honour Jose, first cousin to our captain, and well, I think that's nearly all that I know the name of, your reverence." "I thought you knew me better now than to lie to me, Llewellyn. You know what I mean, as well as I do." To be sure, your reverence. I beg your pardon altogether. I ought to have remembered poor old Nanny Gotobed." The wharf was high, and our gunwale below it. He put his mare at it, clapped in the spurs, and before I could think, or even wonder, he had me by the nape of the neck, with his knuckles grinding into me, and his face, now ashy white with rage, fixed on me, so that I could not move. "Will you tell me?" he cried. "I won't," said I. Crack came his hunting whip round my sides, crack, and whish, and crack again. Then I caught up a broken spar, and struck him senseless over the tail of his horse. The mare ramped all round the half deck mad, then leaped ashore, with her legs all bloody, and scoured away with her saddle off. Chowne lay so long insensible that a cold sweat broke through the heat of my wrath to think that I had killed him, and but for his hat I had done no less, for I struck with the strength of a maddened man, and the spar was of heavy Dantzic. I untied his neckcloth, and ran for water, and propped him up, and bathed his forehead, although my hands were trembling so that I could scarcely hold the swab. And now, as I watched his pale stern face, without a weak line in it, even from fainting, I was amazed at having ever dared to lift hand against him. But what Royal Navyman could ever put up with horsewhip? At last he fetched a strong breath, and opened the usual wickedness of his eyes, and knew me at once, but did not know exactly what had befallen him. I have had a good deal to do with knocking down a good many men, and know that such is their usual practice, and that if you take them promptly, then they will sometimes believe things very freely. Therefore I said, "Your reverence has contrived to hit yourself very hard, but I hope you will soon be better again." "Hit myself! Why, somebody hit me." And then he went off again into a doze, from the buzzing of his head perhaps. Perceiving that he would soon come to himself, and desiring to be acquitted of any violent charge of battery, I jumped down into the hold, and fetched an old broom that was lying there, and hoisted it up in the tackleful, so as to hang at about the right height. Moreover, I put the spar well away, and then with a sluice of water I fetched his reverence back to himself again. I found him very correct this time, and beginning to look about pretty briskly. Therefore I turned him away, and said, "Your reverence must not look at it. It will make your head go round again. Either shut your eyes, or look away, your worship." He seemed not to notice me, so I went on. "Your reverence has had a narrow escape. What a mercy your head is not broken! Your reverence went to chastise me, and lo, your horse reared and threw your reverence against that great boom, which that lubberly Jose has left there ever since we broke cargo." "You are a liar," he said. "You struck me. To the last day of your life you shall rue it." The voice of his throat ran cold all through me, being so low and so cold itself; and the strength of his eyes was coming back, and the bitter disdain of his countenance. The devil who wanted him for a rare morsel in the way of cannibalism stood at my elbow, but luckily thought it sweeter not to hurry it. The foulest man on all God's earth, who made a scoff of mercy's self, lay at my mercy for a minute, defied it, took it, and hated it. For the sake of myself I let him go. For the sake of mankind I should have slain him. Chapter 35.